a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to share my screen briefly. Maybe there. Okay, reminder for compliance with the conference's policy here. So by registering and participating in this event, you agree to abide by the conference's anti-discrimination, harassment, and retaliation policy. Harassment in every form is unacceptable. And if you witness or are subjected to unacceptable behavior, please contact these individuals and these contact points. And all reports will remain strictly confidential. Now, on to our topic and panelists. So, for any who are unfamiliar, the green resource curve refers to the potential for the growing and worldwide renewable energy transition to incite or new or exacerbate existing tensions and conflicts. This is a growing area of research, and three of our presenters today, Kendra Dupuis, Professor John Andrew McNeish, Tracy Stein, plus our discussant, Professor Stacey Vanderveer, are all involved in the ongoing research project, Green Curses and Violent Conflicts, the Security Implications of Renewable Energy Sector Development in Africa, financed by the Research Council of Norway. Further information on this project will be linked in the chat. Now, on to our speakers. I will introduce them very briefly in order, and their more full bios will be included in the chat. So first up, we have Dr. Kendra Dupuis. Dr. Dupuis is a senior researcher at the Friedrich Nansen Institute in Oslo, Norway. She is a political economist who researches energy justice, energy transition, climate finance, and natural resource and environmental governance. John Andrew McNeish is professor of international environment and development studies at the Norwegian Institute of Life Sciences. He is a social anthropologist, specialization in the study of indigenous peoples, politics, and natural resource conflict in Latin America. Next, we have Philippe Lebillon. He is a professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia and a co-founder of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And we have Tracy Stein, who is a co-lead of the Environmental Law Institute section of the Green Curses and Violent Conflicts Research Project. She is Senior Research Director of Government, Nonprofit, and Corporate Affairs for NYU SPS Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab, and is a lawyer by training. Finally, we have Stacey Vanderveer, our discussant. He is a professor of global governance and human security and chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at the McCormick Graduate Institute of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker. Now, after each of the speakers has a chance to present, we will have some comments and initial questions from our discussant, Stacey Vanderveer, and then open for audience Q&A. Kendra, on to you.
Great, thanks a lot. Hopefully my presentation will come up in the meantime. So my name is Kendra Dupuis, and I'm a senior researcher in Norway at a institute called Fridtjof Nansen Institute. And I am a part of a project I'm going to introduce to you today called Green Violent Conflicts, the Contentious Dynamics of Africa's Green Energy Transition. And we'll put the project webpage up in the chat. Slide, please. So let me do some basic facts about green trends in Africa. If you don't mind to push one more time, the text will come up. Yeah, thanks. So first of all, renewable energy production and consumption is increasing in Africa as a way to meet both continental and, of course, global energy and climate goals. So it's projected by the IEA, the International Energy Agency, that about 70% of additional electricity production on the continent by the year 2040 should be coming from renewables, largely from wind, solar, and hydro, and there is enormous potential on the continent for those energy sources. Why is this? Well, of course, there are global climate goals, but also the costs of producing these forms of energy have decreased. There is a real emphasis globally on shifting away from coal, and of course, South Africa is a major coal producer, and there's a lot of donor interest. Yeah, if you don't mind to click one more time there. Yeah. But another side of, and an important side of the green energy transition or revolution is that Africa is and has long been a key site of mineral and metal production, and it will be for in terms of input into green energy infrastructure. So we know that, for instance, cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Zambia, and other key resources like platinum and manganese, which are found in South Africa, copper in Zambia, and aluminum in Guinea. So these are very important inputs into green energy infrastructure. There's a massive increase in mining in Africa that is projected to support all of these green energy projects going on throughout the world, not just in Africa. And we also know at the same time that the mining sector is itself trying to become more green. The World Bank in particular is supporting what they call climate smart mining. So we see the mines moving towards using renewable power and trying to find ways to reduce the footprint, the climate footprint of the mining sector, which is quite large. Next slide, please. Okay, and one more time. So the research project that we are working on looks at the basic question of whether there is and could be what we call a green curse in Africa, playing off the resource curse literature. So we know that while Africa and many places in the world are undergoing a clean energy transition that is likely to accelerate and hopefully will, that this is in particular in Africa occurring in a context where there has been a long history and legacy of poor management of energy, environment, and natural resource sectors, which has led to the so-called resource curse. And the key features of the resource curse are that in resource-rich countries, we, in many cases, see conflict or war, autocracy or non-democratic government, and poverty. One more push there. So basically green in this case, while it's often promoted to be a very good thing, we are questioning whether that is the case. Green may not always be good. Okay, next slide. Okay, one more push. Actually, just do two more pushes. Yeah, one more. Great, thanks. Okay, so back, sorry. Too many. Okay, so our first area of inquiry in this project is we want to know under what conditions the increased development of renewable energy could trigger violent conflict in African states and communities. And in particular, we're looking at solar, wind, and hydro. These are, for now, the major sectors, particularly in Africa. And what we want to do is try to identify pathways to conflicts and causal mechanisms. And also trying to understand when do conflicts escalate to violent conflicts. We may have non-violent conflicts or very low-level conflicts, and we want to know when did it become violent. Okay, next slide, please. And two more pushes. We'll get to the end there. One more. Great, great, okay. Our second area of inquiry, so not only looking at what might cause conflict related to renewable energy, but how might we either prevent or mitigate or resolve such conflicts. So we're looking at, and this is where our friends at the Environmental Law Institute are coming in, is which resource governance arrangements might most effectively mitigate the conflict potential of renewable energy sectors and the value chains associated with them, under what circumstances and why. So trying to map out these types of governance arrangements in Africa and the potential for cooperative arrangements. Okay, next slide. This one, keep going. Two more, three, one more. Great, okay. We're engaging with a few bodies of literature. So as I mentioned earlier, our starting point in many ways has been the resource curse literature, looking at the conditions under which both resource abundance and resource scarcity can lead to conflict. But we're also engaging with some other very important bodies of work to understand the renewable energy conflict relationship. And this includes work that's coming out and has come out recently, including by John Andrew McNeish, on critical perspectives on resource state society relations. There is a small body of literature that does look at links between renewable energy and conflicts. There is, of course, a literature on resource governance, particularly around extractives and other types of resources. And finally, there's a big literature on energy justice that we will engage with. Okay, next slide. And a couple of pushes here, keep going. One more. And one more, sorry. Okay, so just to, so renewable energy is a bit different than what I'm going to call carbon energy sectors or petroleum, natural gas, and mining sectors. So there is a large potential, particularly in Africa, for renewable energy production. However, there is quite uneven, for now, quite uneven foreign investment in these sectors. And quite uneven domestic political emphasis on these sectors. Some countries are continuing to emphasize the production of carbon-based energy sectors. And then a lot of the investment right now in renewable energy is going in particular to South Africa. So we've yet to see major foreign investment in other countries. So another distinguishing factor is that renewable energy production is really important for domestic and regional consumption. It's not really about international export here in the way that carbon-based energy sectors like oil and mining are. And so there actually might be quite a lot of cooperative potential here because of that. A third distinguishing characteristic is that some types of renewable energy like solar or wind are less geographically concentrated or dependent, whereas with mining or oil, you find them in a certain location. However, producing, particularly onshore, some of these power sources requires large tracts of land. And two final distinguishing characteristics is that in some cases, renewable energy sectors require more technical skills and equipment to produce power from these sources. And we also see that there's a lag behind production with governance in terms of how these sectors are regulated. Okay, next slide. So thus far, and two more pushes if you don't mind, thus far we've identified three potential what we call pathways to conflict, three areas or parts of the renewable energy production that might, under certain circumstances, lead to conflict in certain areas. And the first is how and when renewable energy projects are established. And conflicts could arise here over land use, over resettlement, particularly forced resettlement of local communities, and over consultation processes or the lack of consultation. A second area which could potentially lead to conflict is the actual production of renewable energy. And this could be in ongoing projects where there's a lack of particularly local benefits and employment, where projects are just in general, poorly managed, where there's a very high or very large and negative environmental impacts. There could be conflict over control over revenues and security of supply. And finally, in terms of who actually gets to access this energy. And a final area or pathway that we've identified for now is that revolves around mining for the minerals and metal inputs that will be needed for a green energy infrastructure. So as in the resource curse literature, mining and, metals and minerals, valuable ones, can serve as a source of finance for groups that are interested in taking up arms. There could be land conflicts and also just, again, poor management of projects. Okay, next slide. And 3 pushes. Right. So, oops, sorry, go back. Sorry, too. Okay, so, and I'm not going to talk a lot here because our friends from the Environmental Law Institute will talk more, but we know that there are some possible ways to introduce and that there are governance mechanisms for these sectors, including, of course, laws, so regulatory frameworks that govern various aspects of the value chains, but also soft laws, so voluntary initiatives, certification regimes, and so on. Okay, last slide. One more, yep, and just a couple. And just to let you know how we're going about this, because it is a project very much in the works, keep going, there's a few more here. So we are doing a couple things, conducting systematic literature reviews. We have collected project location data and are correlating that, looking at the relationship spatially with location of conflicts. We've done this for 5 African countries. We're also doing on-the-ground work in Uganda to look at past energy conflicts, but also current conflicts around current projects. And one more push, sorry. And then our friends at the Environmental Law Institute are reviewing legal frameworks and the voluntary governance mechanisms for renewable energy projects and metal and mineral inputs. So we should have some outputs coming out soon, and you can check out our webpage if you'd like to learn more or get in touch with any of us that are on the project. Thanks a lot. That's it from me.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Kendra. Next, we have John Andrew McNeish. Take it away.
Let me just put up the slides if I can. So good morning and good afternoon. Not quite good night yet, but great to be here. I'm part of the Green Curses project, but I think every project that works on resource curses should have a skeptic on board, and I am that. So I'm a skeptic towards the whole idea of a resource curse, and I will try and explain why that is the case through this presentation. Here we're thinking very comparatively with regards to looking more closely, in fact, at the context of Latin America. So with regards to the project that has a focus on Africa, sometimes it's worthwhile also to take a step back and look at things from another location, another angle. And this will be the angle of really the angle that I've worked mostly on in terms of looking at questions of resource use and resource politics in the context of Latin America. And so here I've titled this Green Curses and the Persistence of Resource Sovereignty in Latin America. The first picture here is just to remind you that when we're looking at renewable energy resources, that we're not just looking at energy production, but we're also looking at the materials that will be used in the creation of the technologies that are used for renewable energy production. And this is a picture, in fact, of lithium evaporation ponds in Bolivia. Bolivia is one country that is known as one country of what's called the lithium triangle, the 3 countries in the high Andes, northern Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, that have very large resources of lithium under their salt flats, naturally occurring lithium under their salt flats. So it's just a reminder of the fact that we're not only looking at energy production, but also the materials. So moving on, if my computer will allow me to do that. Oh. There we go. This is what I intend to do. So here, what I want to do is to highlight the potential and moves towards a green transition in Latin America. Here we're looking at energy generation and also the raw materials. I want to demonstrate that there's a growing problematic of human rights abuse that accompanies green or renewable energy development. To exemplify that contestation and abuse is sadly nothing new, that rather it builds as it does, in fact, on a long and abusive history of non-renewable resource extraction in the region. Although energy and its form is an important factor, underlying histories of contested sovereignty and the impacts of abusive settler states and corporate practices are powerful contextual factors that result in confrontation and violence. It is in the light of this that I make a case here in this presentation for the importance of what I call resource sovereignty as a means to capture these complex factors and as a step towards considering grounds for better environmental peacebuilding in the region. Arrows are not working yet. There we go. So let me just say a little bit about potential, right? With regards to Latin America, we've already looked at this within the context of Africa. There is also enormous potential in the context of Latin America as well. And this has been to some extent accelerated as well by the current context of the pandemic, where we're seeing an increased sustainability focus from policymakers and investors as the downside risks of traditional energy supplies have become more evident. As of today, Latin America possesses 53% of global electricity generating capacity, coming from clean energy resources. And this is, of course, relating to very much its wealth of water and wealth as well of natural resources. A recent report as well published by the World Economic Forum highlights that Mexico, Chile, and Brazil, along with other Latin American countries, are swiftly developing their solar and wind resources. And this is slowly surpassing as well fossil fuel production from the region. And we can see this also coming about, particularly in the context of Chile. According to the Inter-American Development Bank, Latin America has enough renewable energy potential to meet its 2050 electric demand 20 times over. So there's enormous potential in the region. But at the same time as we're seeing the potential and also seeing that there are developments taking place, we're also seeing a spike as well of injustices that surround also renewable energy development in the region. And so we are then seeing here, this is from a site that looks at business human rights in the region. We are beginning to also see statistics being produced of different cases of abuse related to renewable energy development projects. So here we can see, as on the screen here, there's a record of 501 recorded cases of abuse related to renewable energy development projects. If you look at the map at the bottom, you can also see some countries being highlighted here, and I will bring your attention particularly to the context of Colombia, which is one context that I will touch on more in a moment, and it's a context that I've just returned from as well. Now, this is a statement from Karen Hutlett, who's a researcher at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, from a report that they put out in 2020. And just note here, our research found renewable energy development is, in too many cases, responding the social and environmental violence and harms that have characterized the fossil fuel sector. So what we're seeing here is essentially an extension of pre-existing violence and abuse from the fossil fuel sector into the renewables sector today. And that's a key point that I want to draw attention to, that there is an underlying history here that has to actually be reckoned with. I wanted to just give you a touch on one particular case. I mentioned Colombia. This is a case from Colombia. Here is the case of La Guajira, a case of quite recent renewable energy development. So here, in the context of Colombia, transition has become very much a buzzword in Colombia, leading up to what will be their presidential election this year. So in terms of the major contenders for that election, on the left, the political left, we have Gustavo Petro, who's regarded very much as the forerunner, at least, of the opposition. He has told the newspapers that he will move Colombia away from extractivist economy based on fossil fuels if he's elected president. Meanwhile, President Duque, who's running, of course, for re-election, is a business-friendly candidate, has also committed himself to renewables. Latin America is also an interesting region in terms of climate change policy, because there's no climate change deniers, at least in office right now in Colombia. However, the Colombian government's clean energy transition plan is also controversial. Whilst backing renewable energy development, it also wants to exploit hydrocarbons and has already awarded dozens of exploration and production contracts to this end. So there's this idea that renewables and also non-renewables, that they can coexist. The government's plans, the current government of President Duque, their plans are also controversial because they further add to the high level of social environmental contestation that is already recognized in this country. As you're aware, Colombia has been a country with years and years of civil strife and armed conflict. It has had over 55 years of civil war, and although that was meant to have ended with a peace agreement in 2016, very much of the violence has actually continued in the country. Colombia is identified by Global Witness and numerous national and international scholars as one of the worst countries for the threat and assassination of land defenders, many of them coming from indigenous communities. The country is also already known for problematic social and environmental impacts of both its non-renewable resource extractive sectors. Here it's worth mentioning the recent crises and protests caused by the construction of the Hidroituango Dam, and separately the severe record of socio-environmental impacts caused by mining in the country. Now, one of these projects is of particular note here. The mega mining project of Cerrejón is part of the historical background to the fears and protests that are now being expressed regarding the effort to build out wind power in La Guajira. In La Guajira, El Cerrejón, the open pit gold mine, has faced criticism for its failure to adequately consult local communities. And we're seeing a repeat of that now with the renewable projects in this region. To say a little bit more about La Guajira and the renewable energy project there are plans to build 60 wind power farms. 16 are already approved for this region. La Guajira 1 is set to be the first of 10 new wind farms to be built in the northern eastern part of this department over the next couple of years, adding around 1.7 gigawatts of wind capacity to the national grid. La Guajira, and it's important to note this, is also the ancestral home of the Wayuu Nation, the largest indigenous group in Colombia with over 400,000 people. Members of the Wayuu indigenous community have blockaded roads in the region, alleging that they were not properly consulted about the development of La Guajira 1. And this is very much a continuation of the grievance that they've had, of course, with regards to also the open pit mine they've had there. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Victoria Teulu-Corpuz, has highlighted the imposition of renewable energy projects, including solar, wind, and hydropower, without adequate consultation of local residents. To protect the wind farms in development, the Colombian army has deployed around 2,400 soldiers to the upper La Guajira region. I just want to show you one little thing here. This is a recent Twitter posting that was made by the Colombian army, by the armed forces in Colombia, and I thought you'd just back you up with a little of their dramatic video of them providing security, sovereign security, to also the new wind masts that have been now constructed in this area of Colombia, in La Guajira. I'm not going to show you all of it because essentially it's pretty much the same, right? There's lots of pictures of soldiers standing around and walking around and guarding these wind farms. So the sovereign nature of renewable resources becomes very clear here. That's an important element to grasp. So where I want to go on from this, in terms of saying that this is a sovereign issue, is that when we're looking at this, we should recognize that really maybe we're not just looking at a green curse. It's not enough to just call this a curse. And particularly if we look at the idea of resource curse, as the literature has done, in some cases at least, in a very restrictive manner. We're not really here, it's not only the energy form that actually matters, nor is it just the economics that connect to that energy form, or the institutions that connect to that energy form, or even the law. There is a history here that has to be reckoned with. So La Guajira is a diverse region of desert flatland, vast coasts and tropical forest mountains, and is the fourth poorest province of the country. Arabia is a windswept desert plain in La Guajira, where many of the wind farms are projected to take shape. And this is Colombia's poorest municipality. Human rights organizations see these conditions of desperation and extreme state neglect have tipped the power balance towards the green energy companies, which are offering payments in the form of development projects instead of cash that communities can use to see fit. Everyone are voicing different concerns that there will be less land for the herders to graze, and that the Arujanas, or the outsiders, will change their way of life. But the consensus is that a wind farm would bring more harm than good. Community elders, that is for community elders from the Wayuu community, also underline the importance of the land, considered in Wayuu culture as the mother of the indigenous nation. It's also where they build their homes, where their animals feed, and where their ancestors are buried, and where sacred natural forms such as mountains and rivers reside. The landscape for them is a living landscape. So moving on to this, I want to rather shamelessly really plug my own book, a book which came out earlier this year, back in June of this year, a book called Sovereign Forces.
It's 1 minute, John Andrew.
1 minute, I'm coming to the conclusion. So Summer Forces studies at depth diverse claims to sovereignty over natural resources in Latin American contexts, Bolivia, Colombia, Guatemala. It considers how sovereign claims made from below by indigenous and peasant peoples are a critical part of struggles over power, territory and belonging connected to natural resources. Latin American states are a product of those struggles. So the book emphasizes the analytic value of the concept of resource sovereignty to understand both historic and contemporary social environmental conflicts. So in conclusion, what I'm trying to do here is to suggest that the green curse as an idea is insufficient as an explanation for understanding these conflicts or for dealing with them. Whilst energy form and its relationship to forms of infrastructure, institutions and economy are important, they're only part determinant of outcome. To understand contestation, it's not enough to study energy development in the present or how people or the state think or are organized in the now. We also have to look back at how we got here in the first place. That is, we have to look at the history of social and economic political relations. In Latin America, there's an archaeology of relations that have been created through state formation, and this archaeology needs to be reckoned with. There needs to be a meaningful participation opportunities and engaging more with communities and in forms that acknowledge those injustices of the past. By taking histories of resource sovereignty seriously in the action of existing regulations on consultation and impact analysis, there would be an opportunity to not only understand the concerns of local communities, but also the ontological foundations and grievances on which they are founded. And with that, I'll end. Thanks very much, Jordan.
Thank you, John Andrew. Very interesting. All right, and I will hand it over to our next presenter, Philippe Lebillon.
Okay, you should be seeing my slide now. Hi, so I'm Philippe Lebillon. We're going to go back a little bit. Yeah, you should not see yourselves too much. Up, there you go. Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit to what Kendra presented. So there may be a little bit of overlap, and I apologize for that. I don't see the presentations before. So essentially, I'm going to look back at the resource curse. You know, like John Andrew, I think I'm not really a big fan of the term. In part because it's dehistorized and tend to depoliticize at this in terms of the North-South relations. Okay, so you remember that when we're looking at resource curse conflicts, essentially we're looking at 4 major categories: the resource wars, which are militarized disputes over the control of resources; so-called petroaggressions, whereby local regimes, because it's empowered and generally tends to be a little bit revolutionary, tends to tries to assert regional dominance, including through military means. The third one, which is the one that I've spent quite a bit of time studying, is conflict communities, the so-called fueling of conflicts by resources. Again, we can deconstruct that, but we don't have time for that. And the fourth one, which I think is the most relevant here, is socio-environmental resource conflicts, and that's what John Andrew presented about, which are community-level resistance against extraction projects, associated very often with human rights abuses, environmental abuses, etc. So there's a lot of work that has been done on mining conflicts in particular. I'll refer you, if you're interested, to the article we put together with Marta Conde on factors of resistance. Okay, so the green resource curse, many people are expecting it. It's not going to be as big as it has been for some countries with regard to fossil fuel in particular, but nevertheless, there's going to be both growing wealth and dependence towards those so-called green minerals. But green minerals are only part of the picture, because when I'm thinking about the green resource curse, it's also energy transition towards renewables, as John Andrew mentioned. And so it's very important to look at the rising footprint of green energy projects. A number of critics of these projects have pointed out that, well, you know, we're moving from a kind of subterranean political ecology to a surface political ecology, which actually has a larger footprint. You know, you prefer to have a few head wells in your on your farm. It's not ideal than having it covered with solar panels, as I'm illustrating right here. And the third one is that this green transition is also opening up new green resource frontiers, and new countries that we didn't expect are going to be, you know, involved in that, and others who have already experienced these kinds of things, like Palau with phosphate, is going to experience yet one more round. Okay, so it's quite interesting to look into. So we can discuss a little bit like conceptually how this create thus green energy transition conflicts and green resource extraction conflicts. Okay. For the green energy transition conflicts, I think for many people, it's not really where we look at, because we tend to look at where places of extraction and renewable projects take place. But we also have to think about the international political economy of energy or the regional dynamics. And so it's important to consider, for example, fuel riots, rise in price and taxes. Of course, anybody in Europe at the moment is aware of that because of natural gas high prices. And the Gilets jaunes was a good example. It also has an impact on the local political economies of these countries. And that's where we're actually quite close to the classic resource scarce discourses around poverty, inequality, etc. So the collapse of fossil fuel dependent economies, there's been a number of papers on this. Many people will remember the collapse of oil prices in 2015-16 in particular. So I just put that. So civil unrest can be a factor there. And of course, there is resistance and protest, disputes, sometimes quite violent over green energy project, whether it's extraction or in the case of wind farms here. Most of you working on this, of course, remember the San Mateo del Mar massacre with 15 people were killed at a COVID checkpoint. They were ambushed by, thugs hired by the mayor. So we're dealing with, nasty things. I can refer you to the work of Alexander Dunlap, who's done fantastic work in this realm. Okay, so to provide a little bit of a big picture, I'm going to go back to a paper that was led by my colleague at Barcelona, Leah Temper. I'm going to send in the chat for those of you who are interested to look into it, the reference. But essentially, it was an attempt to understand the socio-environmental conflicts associated with what we called climate futures. People resisting fossil fuel, so it's part of the green transition. They're trying to block pipelines and prevent new oil fields from being developed, etc., or gas fields, and others that deal much more with the renewable aspect. So here, what we're missing at the moment is green metals extraction. So that's going to be another paper, but there's still quite a lot of information. One of the first and quite striking finding was that actually it was nearly a 50-50 in terms of the number of conflicts out there between green energies and fossil fuels. And knowing, of course, that fossil fuels have a much longer history than green energy ones. And so that really shows the intensity of socio-environmental struggles that we've got out there. And you can see that hydroelectric and biomass is very important, and wind farms a little bit less. So here I put a little bit the type of people who were involved, and as you can see, it's generally diverse, but it differs according also to the location. So again, I don't have time, so just refer back to the paper if you're interested. Because we're looking at conflicts, I focus here a little bit on the intensity of these conflicts and where which types of projects are seeing them. So we see generally quite high intensity for both fossil fuel and low carbon emission project. And as you can see, criminalization is very strong and dominated generally by the fossil fuel, which are on the left. But we see that also happening for the green transition ones on the right. As I mentioned, land, biomass, hydropower are the more important one. Nuclear power seems to see fewer. It's also part of the green transition conflicts, and wind and solar as well. Okay. In terms of the outcomes of those socio-environmental struggles, well, the vast majority tend to be unaffected or simply amended, but a number are suspended and canceled. And we can see that it's roughly a similar proportion. So I invite you also to look at it to know why this is happening. Okay, so when we're looking at green resource extraction conflicts, we can look at the territorial disputes over green mineral deposit, opposition to green mineral project, conflicts associated with green mineral operations, and conflicts over the opening up of new resource frontiers. So here I did a very preliminary scoping thing in like half an hour, just to try to understand where they are concentrated. And we can see why John Andrew has lots of work ahead of him, because Unsurprisingly, a lot of these conflicts are taking place in the Andean region, Latin America more generally, in part because there is this, I would not like to say political culture of opposition, but there is definitely a kind of contentious style of politics in those regions, and many communities have felt empowered in the past for resistance. So we see more and more, but by far that's not the only places where we'll see that. So if we look at the green resource curves, when we're thinking about the curves and simply like wealth and dependence, etc., I look here at a report, it's a bit dated 2018 on conflict minerals and the fuel of conflicts, but overall the picture is not as bad as it is for fossil fuel. As you see, essentially, yes, there are fragile states that have reserve, and a number of reserves are in those fragile states, but it's not as strong as we've seen for fossil fuels, etc. So that will be part of my conclusion. So just to shortcut a little bit, the conclusions are, first of all, that decarbonization of the economy is by no means inherently environmentally innocuous or socially inclusive. Okay, so although many corporations and politicians, etc., are trying to mobilize this idea that because it's green, it's fair, it's good, it is not the way many communities see it. In my own region, for example, we've got a massive offshore wind farm project, and it's massively opposed now. It started with just a few fishermen, and then it's grown into a social contestation movement. So that's also important to see. So that leaves a little bit the transition also in a conundrum. How are we going to make that transition if we cannot move towards renewable energy, get more green minerals, etc.? So some people are really worried about that. My own school is, of course, generally that we've got to look more at degrowth, okay, and de-intensifying our energy. And so, of course, that means trying to change the international political economy or ways of life, very complex one. Okay, second point is the green resource cost concerns are not that different from the fossil fuel resource concerns. I would say they are more to do with local community than higher level impacts of revenues in particular, because the scale of revenues and distribution of reserves suggest that green resource cost should be a lesser problem than we have seen. Okay, so addressing the green resource cost conflicts should include, and here it's the classics list. So managing a fair transition for producers and consumers, the two sides, diversifying revenues in both fossil fuel and green producing regions and countries, consolidating institutions, ensuring democratic participation in decision making, FPIC and the rest. Although with John Andrew, we did a paper that was very, very harsh critique of this, preventing disputes and market instabilities, and focusing on energy degrowth rather than green energy. Okay, so last point is, I think, the main thing that we take. And for people who are really on the ground, like Alexander Dunlap, going from places of resistance to places of resistance, that's the main message that we get. But of course, as we saw with the little video, that's not often the vision that the state has, which is on the contrary, a highly militarized police state that can be disciplined into the production of a green future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe. All right, and to our final presenter, Tracy Stein. Take it away. You are on mute, Tracy.
Okay, I'm going to get my screen up. I hope this works. Ugh. Oh no. It's sorry, I'm trying to get my screen up. Maybe it'll be easier if I do it this way.
That's okay. While you were doing that, to all of our attendees, if you have any questions for our presenters that have already gone, or Tracy while she speaks, please feel free to post those in the chat, and for when we open the audience Q&A after our discussant has a chance to make some initial questions. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. How do it's blocking me and it's putting me through security and privacy. Does anybody know how to do this? Oh,
Maybe
okay.
a settings issue.
All right, you know what I want to do? I'm going to copy my link and I'm going to ask Fabian to help me with this instead, okay? Because it's giving me a security problem. Fabian, are you able to pull it up and share it?
Sorry, it tells me access denied.
Oh gosh. Okay, what is, I can send it to your email. What is your email? You're at Graduate Institute?
Yeah.
Okay. I think this should do it. And in the meantime, I'll get started. And I hope you'll be able to get it on right away. I apologize, everybody. I apologize. And we're talking solutions even. So this is hopefully we'll get a good solution here. But in the meantime, I'm working on behalf of the Environmental Law Institute, and we are looking at solutions to all of the problems that have been discussed in the course of this. We are looking at the types of laws and legal protections that exist on the books in many of the developing countries. We're looking specifically at sub-Saharan Africa that have the potential to reduce some of the conflicts that we've talked about, mostly land conflicts that come with the renewable energy development and the mining needed for the technologies. Oh, good. Yay. Okay, great. So you could go ahead and go to the first slide. And go to the, perfect, keep it there. Those are our key governance structures. So our study isn't looking at political reality. You know, this is not an issue of what's really happening, what a government is able to do. It's what's on their books. Whether a country is able to implement those protections is not what we are dealing with. We're looking strictly at the potential of the books. And there are, as you can see, 5 specific categories. And a lot of these have already even been discussed. The first and foremost is guaranteeing land and resource rights to those who exist on those lands. The second that I'll get into is managing environmental and social harms that come with development. The third is providing for adequate and just compensation and benefit sharing where there is conflict over land use. The fourth is ensuring access to information and public participation about development decisions that will impact the lands. This is something that everybody has talked about, democratic governance, really important. And then finally, what kind of legal recourse do the people to the individuals have to enforce all of these various rights? And in the course of our study, we have been looking at, we'll be looking at about 50 sub-Saharan countries. We've gotten through more than half of them. And what we've learned is that there are already a lot of legal protections on the books. And there are a number of different trends that have come up. And there's certainly a number of lapses. So we'll move to the first slide, if you could. And this one is about protecting land rights. Renewable energy development will require land and resources. It presents the ever-present conflict where these natural resources also conflict. The natural resources are central to livelihoods and lands held by individuals and groups of people, often for generations, and under different customary land tenure systems. And failure to recognize customary land and resource rights has a long history of land displacement and loss of livelihood, whereas customary tenure and resource protections in the law are critical to empowering individuals and local communities in decisions impacting land and resource use. And among the laws we considered, we looked at these various things. We looked at whether a country recognizes customary land tenure, whether it recognizes customary resource rights, rights of artisanal miners, and then the relative rights of the surface owners versus really those who are the mining companies coming in and mining subsurface. If you could move to the next slide. A couple of interesting trends. So our survey so far has identified that the overwhelming majority of countries recognize and now protect customary land rights. Some countries have implemented a registration system that incorporates them in a registration system, and others recognize them without formal title. But it does provide a protection in these places where customary tenure is far more common than what we know in the United States and elsewhere. In general, surface holder rights are subordinate to subsurface holder mining rights. But even so, we have found that numerous protections are on the books to compensate surface holders for damages to their property or disturbances to their land. And then we looked at the rights of artisanal and small scale miners. Usually those are local and individuals who have been also using the land and mining for long generations. And the trend in that has also been interesting. Vast majority of countries now recognize the artisanal small-scale mining rights and have formalized the sector through licensing. And it's aimed at protecting livelihoods and putting artisanal miners on a more fair legal footing with large-scale mining companies. I'm going to turn to our next category of protections. They are, designed to reducing environmental and social impacts. A longstanding problem with development, of course, is its impact on the environment and local communities, and it's namely the potential for environmental contamination and other health and safety hazards. We looked at various provisions to address these impacts, namely through things like licensing requirements and environmental protections and worker protections. And you can move to the next slide, and I'll tell you some of the trends that we found. As one of the most positive recent trends, the vast majority of countries surveyed have enacted increasingly strong environmental and social standards in permitting processes. Most surveyed countries require environmental impact assessments as part of licensing, both in mining and electricity generation. Some legal requirements go so far as to demand analysis of potential climate impacts, effects on local communities, jobs, and food security, all as part of granting and issuing licenses. Many countries have enacted broad environmental regulations. Some noteworthy environmental laws require the developer to issue ongoing environmental management assessments and self-monitoring plans, impose fines on developers for environmental violations. The vast majority of countries also provide substantive worker safety requirements under mining laws. Several noteworthy laws require worker health and safety insurance. They empower the government to terminate licenses or issue fines based on worker violations. And then lastly, site remediation is always a major issue, and we found that the vast majority of the countries that we have reviewed so far require some type of site remediation. A site remediation plan may go so as a country may go so far as to require bonds, provide local socioeconomic support after a mine closes, and impose other types of rehabilitation orders. If we could turn to the next slide. Thank you so much, Fabian. I appreciate it. Compensation and benefit sharing, where governments do displace owners as part of the public interest in development projects. Inadequate compensation for land is a long-standing threat and issue. And on the flip side, there may be a lesser chance of conflict where local communities share in the benefits of development. So you can go to the next slide. Some of our trends that we have found. In a positive trend, the vast majority of countries require compensation for landowners when land is taken, including compensation for the value of the land. It could be improvements to the land. In some cases, we saw damages for disturbance or even nuisance cost. Another positive trend, alternative, is options for resettlement. Often that may be a better result for landowners that can achieve a better living condition and keep their land resource. So a number of countries have made efforts to make sure that there are opportunities for resettlement and that those costs are covered. Less consistent, we have found compensation when there is a loss of access to the land's resources. A growing minority of countries appear to have laws that provide compensation for lost business, livelihood, or crop yield as a result of interference by mining with their surface land when in the case of mining companies coming in. But it does have a slightly growing trend, a positive trend. Another very positive trend, numerous countries have environmental laws that require developers to pay for environmental damage. There is a growing legal trend to provide for benefit sharing for mining, including revenues, whether they're taxes, royalties, and other things, other kinds of monetary compensation to local communities, or requiring companies to enter into community development plans with local communities where the locals can share in the benefits of the company coming in. Then let's turn to the next one, access to information and participation. And this is something that has come up, I think, in everybody else's discussion about local communities not having enough access to the decisions impacting them. We looked at national laws that recognize some form of access to information and participatory rights because they do increase transparency and accountability, and they elevate local role in decision-making, reduce corruption. These are all factors that have been discussed to help diffuse or reduce conflict. As you can see, a number of things, a number of the laws that we looked at whether or not access to information on project activities, the permitting process itself, revenues, environmental or social impact assessments. And the next slide will tell you a few of our interesting trends. The vast majority of countries studied provide what we have found are relatively strong access to information laws, becoming more standard. Numerous countries have enacted broad access to information acts that cover a host of important regulatory agencies, including their decisions over siting, operations, licensing, revenue, and more. And where there are general access to information acts, we have found specific mining laws that require revenue and other disclosures through mining cadastrals that appear to provide more transparency in the sector. The vast majority of countries also have broad disclosure requirements relating to environmental impact assessments. Unfortunately, we have also found the trend is legal rights to participation are generally more limited. And that is, again, a governance issue that is going to be an ongoing problem. The one notable exception is that there is a growing trend for participation when it comes to environmental impact assessments, requiring some kind of consultation with communities, including sometimes even a role in hearings. And then my last section goes to legal recourse, access to justice and legal recourse. All of these legal measures provide protections with the potential to reduce conflict, but none can provide protection, in fact, for local landowners without access to courts or administrative bodies to enforce the protections. And this is an area we have found the most weaknesses in our section. If you want to turn to the last slide, which has a couple of our trends. Our survey so far suggests that the vast majority of countries provide for access to justice when it comes to asserting basic land rights, opposing dispossession or eminent domain, or obtaining just compensation for lands that are going to be taken. Few countries provide standing or legal recourse to actually enforce environmental impact assessments or benefit sharing requirements, licensing requirements. Many countries provide for regulatory enforcement through ministries without this kind of individual recourse. And of course, these protections can only be as strong and just as those leading the ministries. So my conclusion is we hope that this survey highlights the many laws that are already on the books in many countries, and the potential that they have to reduce drivers of conflict. If there are strong government institutions prepared to enforce these provisions over what we know are sometimes very competitive development interests, we are hopeful that a green resource curse is not inevitable. Thank you. And thank you again, Fabian, for stepping in and saving the day.
Thank you, Tracy and Fabian. All right, so now we have our discussant for any initial comments and questions you may have for our presenter, Stacey Vanderveer. Stacey, you're on mute.
I think after an endless pandemic, I wouldn't do that anymore. Thanks so much. I'm going to be brief because we want to leave lots of time for discussion. So I'm gonna thank Kendra, John Andrew, Philippe, and Tracy for great presentations. Audience members and especially students in the audience. These are people who've done lots of great work on these issues. So look them up and dig around on their CVs and on the reports at the Environmental Law Institute, and you will find awesome stuff. So I'm going to just toss out 3 questions, and I think probably, Jordan, you should just go on to questions after that, and my colleagues can kind of chicken scratch some things they want to answer or work in as they go, but let's get out to the audience. So 3 things for me that that each of you subsequently can think about whether you want to address. The first is that on the concept of the green resource curse. So I think it is becoming quite clear and now widely understood among a lot of social science researchers and others that a kind of clean energy transition doesn't automatically bring very much improvement in the humanitarian and ecological impacts of our global political economy and global energy system. So I think that point is being driven home with the concept, but I'm wondering that kind of beyond that, what advantages do you sort of see in the term, or what directions do you think we should keep exploring in conceptualizing the term? The second related question is, I share some of your reservations about the resource curse concept, certainly, and its limitations. One of the things it does do is kind of serve as a sort of basket of pretty intractable problems. And I wonder if you think that that there are sort of better concepts for pursuing more persuasive ideas about what can be done about these ecological and humanitarian harms that often get and governance challenges that often get kind of tossed into this basket concept. And the third and related question is about in these research projects, I wonder if any of you have found examples, more positive, more progressive, more hopeful examples, either at the project or community level or at the national policy level, to which you would point for sort of inspiration about better modes, better outcomes to grapple with some of the challenges that are all over this area of research. I'll leave it there and say thank you again. And I will do one thing for Jordan and remind audience folks to put questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Stacey. And actually, before I let our panelists get to addressing any of Stacey's questions, we have one question in the chat that actually follows nicely onto his last question, which is, how can good governance of green energy metals and minerals be fostered in countries with a poor track record of governance? Often fighting corruption and impunity is proposed, but has no coherent strategy or best practices. So, easy question. Anyone want to jump in?
I'm happy to just say that question is always on our mind when we're looking at solutions, because we are looking at so many countries that have this terrible, without naming any names, but terrible track record of governance, and yet they have certain laws on the books, right? So there's the potential, but there's no we know that we're doing this sort of as a, academic exercise without the will, without a country that is committed to enforcing good governance. And so for us, it's a constant challenge. We know that there's the potential, and maybe with the right leaders, maybe it's a question of who's in power when, and maybe it's good that some of the books, the laws exist on the books, because when those people who are able to come into power can enforce them and really lead to good governance, will be in a good position. But it is something that constantly we struggle with. So I'm not really answering it other than to say it is ever present on our minds.
Just to answer that question. I mean, I agree with Tracy. Law is important, right? But I will name names. I've just come back from Colombia, and Colombia is a disaster area in the sense that it has all the right institutions. All the democratic institutions exist. It's extremely progressive in terms of lawmaking. It's extreme, not only progressive, it's innovative in terms of lawmaking, but it doesn't make a difference because there is a lack of political will in terms of the state and state institutions to actually employ the law and to regulate. And so as a result of that, you have not only terrible conditions of insecurity in the country, but you also have terrible conditions as well of environmental destruction in the country. And unfortunately, it's very hard to actually see where the answer to that will be, other than actually also relying on the international community to also put pressure on the Colombian government, or to encourage them to actually begin to apply the law and also use their institutions to also defend, rights of both people and nature in that country.
Yeah. So just to add a little bit on this, a few things. So first, I think, and we're seeing that in Canada now, benefits impact agreements or impact benefits agreements are really a key to relations between companies and First Nation groups, local communities in general. And quite a lot of First Nations have decided, we're not going to basically fight this off. We're just going to embrace it and make as much money as possible, because we know it's going to be difficult to fight it. So we may as well be shareholders. And like that, we'll have access to the stuff. So from the get-go, they insert themselves into the operation. So it's a little bit like the manufacturing model in Germany, that the unions are part of the kind of shareholders and decision makers. They sit on boards. That works way better than in France, where it's strike after strike and all the rest. That being said, we know there is also a lot of inequalities within those communities, and some families that are very prominent may benefit, etc. So its first thing is, rather than automatically push back, sometimes think about, okay, if you get in. So I'm not pro mining, I'm not pro all this, but I'm saying that's often a reality. The second thing is really pushing for more like grassroots extraction that benefits communities through their own institutions, etc., at their own pace. So it's a little bit like what we've seen with artisanal mining areas, artisanal fishing areas, etc., is to let people go and organize the cooperatives that allow them to feel much more in control of the pace and the extent, and also get more revenues out of it, etc. So all that also consists in two options. Very often, some of the larger companies don't have an interest in that, and instead they're trying to push a hardening model. But smart companies are also understanding that this is sometimes something you've got to do, and so they open up to partnerships, etc. So that's a few things. Another one I just posted is, of course, supply chain monitoring, cleaning, auditing, etc. There's lots of issues with that. I work quite a bit on it, and it's part of the solution. And I think Tracy was really good at fantastic outlining all these laws, etc. So audited can go into those spaces and say, well, here you go, here you don't. The problem is the international political economy for many of these commodities means that a large number of companies can come and operate, and with very different standards. So it's really at the level of the country that they need to do, like everybody needs to be audited, as soon as they move beyond a certain scale, at least. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, John Andrew, you had a comment?
Yeah, it was a bit of a rejoinder to Philippe. I mean, I very much agree. Local ownership is important, and there are some really good examples. Actually, historically speaking, Denmark is a fantastic example of, for example, local ownership of renewable energy production, and just as an example. But context matters. Context really, really matters, and so it's great to talk about Denmark. Maybe it's also great to talk about Canada. But when we also look at other places as well, if the public institutions aren't working, if the apparatus for law in the country isn't working and the state isn't responding, you can get a condition where local ownership of energy production ends up also be local ownership as well of illegal forms as well of entering into either energy production or also mineral extraction. And so that's the case in Colombia, is that when the Colombian state doesn't intervene, doesn't apply the law, then there's not only the continuance of artisanal mining, but we also find people moving over from artisanal mining into illegal, small-scale, illegal gold mining. So they are also successful entrepreneurs, albeit successful indigenous entrepreneurs in the illegal sector. So I mean, context really matters here, and so there's important to think about the conditions of politics. And also the kinds of pressure that need to come to bear in order to transform those more problematic contexts, those more undemocratic contexts, perhaps, that we would talk about.
Well, thank you both. We actually have a couple sort of follow-up and counter questions in the chat related first to the corruption question and then also to the involvement of communities. So first on the corruption counter sort of question, where the responsibility and accountability, where are the responsibility and accountability for the global north and the extractive companies based there? And sort of a follow-up to that as well, what is the sort of role or of the complex relations between the different domestic and international actors and the way they influence resource extraction on the ground across numerous types of countries? And a third question, or 1.5 question. We have Salim Ali mentions a green resource curse is a symptom of non-systems thinking. But part of the challenge is that alternatives such as next-gen nuclear are also shot down by activists, often with errant data and miscommunication of risk. How can we operationalize a systems approach to scientific decision-making around the low-carbon transition when there will not be win-win options, which goes a bit to what Philippe was talking about with the communities getting involved in benefit sharing sorts of things. Comments or follow-up on those?
Yeah. I think it has to do with levels of education, consultation, the whole mix, and as John Andrew also mentioned, people build on histories. If they've had a history of deception, showing that they should not show any trust towards the consultants that come in and provide them with like the results of the EIAs, etc., then or they've been swindled by previous deals, including by members of their own communities. There can be a lot of resentment. So, and also we should not be blinded by the fact that allianceship sometimes is very problematic. We've got the Ferry Creek example here, where we've got a logging company that is owned and operated to a large extent by First Nations and wants to harvest before things are rotting. But at the same time, you've got people saying it's the last growth, old growth, we should leave it. And so a few people from the indigenous communities are providing the legitimacy for vast numbers of settlers, to put the word bluntly, to bar indigenous people from exploiting their own resources. So very complicated situations. And we see a whole array, I mean, on that previous questions, like, of course, these are, very, very intricate relationship between international consultants, the regional development banks, the companies, local authorities, both customary and on the state side, etc. So that's why there are so many interesting, detailed case studies on that, but very often difficult to navigate. And people who navigate it the most with the most interest and effect are often the consultants working for those companies, because that informs essentially the political maneuvering at many different scales of the companies and local authorities, etc.
Thank you, Stacy, and then John Andrew.
Just briefly, about the comments about the international corporations. I don't think any of the research is trying to let the international corporations off, but I do think it's important to note that big mining corporations, especially the northern-based ones, are a lot more like Nike and Adidas than they are like, big companies that own mines in the developing world. They mostly buy stuff. They mostly separated themselves from the dirty business of actually mining. And the players in many of these parts of the world who are mining are domestic players. Now, yes, they're getting a lot of money from the outside, and I think that's one avenue that cries out for better governance. But the states and the domestic firms are often, for example, the forces of militarization at a mine, or even more shockingly, I have to say, those are amazing pictures, John Andrew, of militarizing a wind farm, which it just reveals the limits of my dystopic imagination that I imagined that wind farms would be less militarized than mines, but now that bias is corrected.
Thank you, John Andrew.
Yeah, we have to recognize, of course, regulation has improved, right? So there's the world today, and regulation today, and law today is not what it was 10 years ago. So there are significant improvements taking place. There is an effort to clean up, Mining Corporations Act or Energy Companies Act and regulate and do things better. So there's no doubt about that. But just like Nike, they are very often companies that have lots of subsidiaries and different parts, and so they are running sweatshops and just like these big companies in the sense that they are also involved in dirty activities. You would hope that the international community could intervene and put pressure, create further regulation, and I think they do. There are different organizations, UN organizations, other international organizations that are very important in this. But I think that we also shouldn't be naive to the fact as well that national interests also play in here as well at the international level, even from the north. And so, I'd like to, try and excuse my own country, Norway, from this, but unfortunately I can't, because Norway also has its own interests in terms of mining or in terms of renewable energy production, and is also involved in many of the same kinds of contestations and disagreements and dirty business that we would find elsewhere. So we can't fully excuse them either. And so there needs to be an awareness of that. What we're looking at, and I think Alexander Dunlap, who's been mentioned here by Philippe, would very much push this forward, is that this is a problem of capitalism, right? This is a problem of basically, renewable energy development not taking much of a different form in terms of its, of its basic economics and politics to what we've seen before. This is it's capitalism 2.0 with regards to energy production. So in that regard, I very much agree. We have to look at the global system. I think beyond Alexander, which also needs to be stressed, however, is it's not just a problem of capitalism, it's a problem of racism. And that is something that we inherit from a deeper history. It's a deeper history of colonialism and imperialism that also has to be recognized. And that is very hard for an international system to deal with. And it can only be dealt with when they start opening the doors as well to people who have not had enough of a voice up until present. And that means that we have to open the doors up to indigenous peoples, peasant peoples, other excluded communities into international discussions about law and regulation. That is happening, but it has to happen at a greater scale.
Thank you both. So we have about 8 minutes left. We can take another few questions if there are any additional questions from the audience. Well, we have a comment that is the challenge of billionaires who embrace conservation to maintain their own land control. Not inopportune. And if there are no, and we have a question. from Salim Ali. Fabian, are you able to?
Yep, I think I can. I've been unmuted. So yes, thank you. I just wanted to try to synthesize some of the thoughts here. As was noted by John Andrew, the question is around control and inequality of wealth to some degree, and it's happening on both ends of the spectrum. And my concern is that science is suffering, both from the environmentalist side of the spectrum. Many of these extremely hyper-wealthy people who have given so much money to conservation groups that they have themselves become like quasi-corporations. And you have, of course, the existing entrenched establishment of private sector interests. And in many cases, they are intertwined because the same people who made money in the private sector have now become great conservationists in their second lives post their wealth. So I think that has really created a perfect storm for bad governance, where science is really suffering because you are not getting good data to make decisions on what kind of technologies to choose. And so I think that's where our community can play a role to make sure that bridging is done effectively.
Thank you for those comments. Are there any reactions from our panelists? Go ahead, Stacy.
I was just going to say that to illustrate the connections of a couple of those points, billionaires who become, global conservationists have a lot in common with, sovereigns who preserve their land and aristocrats who did lots of things. So, I mean, if we want to think about where this model of, of saving nature and creating boundaries comes from, it has a very long and distinguished tradition that predates the billionaires, is what I would say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But the challenge here is that these are rags to riches people who can claim also that they came from very poor backgrounds and they're self-made and they're the perfect American dream. And whereas the old world people, they had their dynastic entitlement. So you've got, like in India, you have people like Arun Agarwal, who, not to be confused with the Anil Agarwal, sorry, not to be confused with the great political scientist. He started off as a copper wire salesman, and now he owns Vedanta, one of the largest copper mining companies in the world. And he many times plays his poverty card that I'm a rags to riches guy, while still maintaining these other issues. So that's, I think, the slight twist, Stacy, to the new generation of autocracy.
Thank you for that. All right, are there any additional questions from the audience for our panelists on any of the discussions? And if not, do any of the panelists have questions for each other about the content or future paths of this research? I don't see anything from the audience. So panelists, we have about 4 minutes. If you have any super quick questions for each other, please go ahead. John Andrew.
I'm a little interested. I mean, so we can have a conversation about capitalism and we can talk about alternatives. So one of the alternatives that was mentioned was degrowth. Philippe mentioned this in his presentation and comments. And I think that degrowth is an interesting idea. But I think a question to Philippe is, what do we do about racism? Because the degrowth is a great idea, but it's an economic term, it's an economic understanding. Mm-hmm. So what does it do, with regards to, the underlying issue, the underlying of many settler states, which is not really just capitalism, but actually racism?
Well, I think there is a direct relationship in settler societies where it's more, exploitative. So a very, very simple thing we had that, the city council discussion here is, and it shows the complexity of it. But some people thought, okay, fracking is bad. Essentially, we're fracking in the north. It affects negatively a lot of First Nations, but at the same time, it provides livelihoods. And so let's shift to other forms of energy, etc. So they've changed, for example, the norms. So I don't know if it's really degrowth, but it's degrowth in terms of energy. So we're much the standards are now trending towards having passive houses. Well, you know, before here, it was like very, very negligible. So those are the kinds of things where we can think, okay, can there be degrowth in certain domains where the racist dimensions of the impacts are particularly acute, and integrate that in the prioritization of our degrowth strategies, you know? So, you know, you look at where are the nastiest impacts, and you know what kind of new norms, reforms, or changes in consumer behaviors could have an impact. You know, typically we did a project a year ago with the School of Journalism on fish farm that basically you know funds the Norwegian dominated salmon farming around the world. And obviously this is super nasty, you know, so you can say like, well, it's a very racist attitude that we have, that we want, you know, farm salmon for cheap. Well, this is literally taking sardinellas out of the mouth of Senegalese people who need in order to go to bed with at least a minimal protein intake and for the kids' growth. And so again, this is one aspect of degrowth in the fishing industry. Etc. You know, and so you've got to look at who are the intermediaries. Well, it's 5, you know, fish farm plants, most of them controlled by, you know, Chinese you know, capitalists, to use the term, and you know, and Norway turns a bit of a blind eye on this to some extent. I'm characterizing, but yeah, it's just to give you a little bit of an example. So I think there could be lots of those different initiatives. I mean, Salim, I'd be interested to have your opinion a little bit on deep sea mining. We're trying to get a little op-ed on this, on the impact of deep sea mining on artisanal mining in the DRC. So to come back to the green curse and cobalt, etc. There is a risk that if deep sea mining goes fast, and as you've seen, many companies, including one in Vancouver, you look at the promotional material, and very often you'll see a 12-year-old child, you know, so you think like, why are they using that? Well, it's the instrumentalization, and it's another form of racism. It's, you know, kind of, you know, the victimization, the instrumentalization of the victimization of child labor for the purpose of attracting venture capitalists into closing a deal on you know, South Pacific nodules harvesting. And so these are really interesting questions to look into. So I don't know, Salim, what you take on that, for example, but sometimes I'm thinking there are spaces where we should have like blank bans and you know, and force the capitalist system to behave differently. I'm not saying like moving, but yeah, I'm getting lost here probably.
Okay, thank you. And while I am sure that would be fascinating discussion, we are at our time, and so if I do encourage everyone or those interested in continuing the conversation to connect, but unfortunately we will have to close this panel. Thank you all for your participation, for your questions, and for your comments, and thank you especially to our panelists and our discussants for fascinating presentations and excellent food for thought. So thank you all. And please enjoy the rest of the conference.